Ja, maar met softphone natuurlijk. Helemaal gek. Ja, exact. Dat ook niet vergeten. Dat is waar. Top brand erg plus 373. Dat zal wel... Ja, hier wel.
Okay.
No.
Well, I talked to Tim about it, and Tim was going to get up and say we're headed toward.
Start te maken.
Then you have to describe the whole fight.
All right, good afternoon, folks. I'm Tim, and this is DNS Operations. So, more mic? Swallow the mic. I'll give you more mic. So, you know who we are. I'm Tim. That's Benno. That's Suzanne. There in front is our ISG overlord, Warren. So, Dan York's doing JabberScribe, so he gets priority at the mic. And Paul, who I saw right there, is taking minutes for us. So, thank you, both you guys. It's Tuesday, so you should have seen the note well. The big improvement is I fixed the color of the links from ugly blue to gray. So, big advancements there. There are blue sheets going around, and so please fill them in. We've got a good crowd here, so I like to put everybody's name on it, sort of thing. So we've got a bunch of agenda items, as you well know. So we double dare you. So mostly we got some updates of current stuff. Sarah is going to talk about the hackathon results, which were some interesting stuff there. I know some people have heard it at least once, maybe twice, but you can always listen to Sarah talk 3 times, so it's always good. And mostly today's all current stuff, so things that we've actually talked about in the past. Friday is going to be, essentially the new session stuff. Some updates. There's this KSK Futures BOF Thursday morning. So, and of course, we all know everything about the KSK, and there's no reason to sort of discuss about it, but I know Paul's putting that together. There's a mailing list on it and all sorts of good stuff. So just giving you a heads up on that. Side meeting tomorrow. Oh, yeah, good times in the Doe context. This is sort of the issues raised. This is all about what I would say about operator stuff and things like that. And I do know coming out of the Doe meeting that all of that work about operations around Doe is not coming here. So, we refuse it. So, we refuse it. So, and we actually have good precedent because we're doing some operations documents in dprive, and they're basically staying in dprive because of the type of work it is. So, sorry, web people, you have to sort of suck it up and deal with that. So, so
My tactful co-chair.
yeah. And just a little DNSSEC news, because I know we all love DNSSEC. Our employers started rolling out a bunch of DNSSEC to customers, and a lot of the stuff that we've done is driving a lot of IETF discussions. Schumann and Pallavi are going to discuss about their multi-provider DNSSEC draft. In DPRIVE, we have a draft on how to do AXFR over DNS over TLS, which seems kind of interesting. So, but big props to Allison and her team, Sarah, Schumann, Pallavi, and Han. So it's been a bunch of work. So, yeah, it's very great. So document updates. Bunch of stuff since the last meeting. So yeah, that's some serious business there. And of course, Adderleaf's already got an errata. So Dave Cocker's, banging himself in the head on that. So terminology, yeah, this is a big collection of stuff. So big thanks to everybody, the authors, especially Warren, for helping shepherd those through. That was a big pile of stuff. We've got one more in the editor queue that's been sitting there for a while, that the DNS capture format, and it's basically waiting on this CBOR CDL document. I went and looked at it and was like, okay, that's in some IETF land. I don't understand the RFC editor technology. Though. Go ahead, Paul.
CDDL just got moved to the RFC editor.
There we go. So it'll be done soon. So yay. An algorithm update. I know there's a small fix that Mr. Paul Wooders wants to put in there, but it's on the telechat. And Warren, there's some little editing that just needs to be done, and I think it can be done during the telechat discussion. I will page you in on all that. You see all the emails, so I'll make sure it's all put back in your brain, okay? So in current working group last call is extended error. It's kind of been sitting there, and it's been interesting because we've got some good results out of the hackathon that sort of generate some comments on how to essentially describe things a bit better. So I know Wes has promised me, because we talk at 6 a.m. every morning, that he's going to spin a new version with some of that, and he's going to address that.
Yeah, Wes Herdiker, ISI. Yeah, a new version will be coming soon. The comments are really well appreciated, and I love the fact it was implemented at the hackathon. That was thumbs up.
I totally love it too. So that's great. So we just discussed that. And we have this call for adoption active on DNS Zone Digest, and the feedback we've seen looks like we're going to call it adopted. We're just waiting for, probably just because we're busy doing other stuff. But yes, that looks like it's good. So thanks all. 7816 biz, which is QNAME minimization. It's kind of stalled according to the authors, but just mostly needs some time and some reviews. And we're probably going to see that. I'm hoping for some updates by Montreal. That's good. It's the first time that I'm actually poking at authors to tell them to get moving. Usually they're kind of kicking me. Serve stale. Interesting mailing list discussions. How's that? It's probably a polite way to say it. It's a nice combination of technical and IPR issues. And so I like how the authors are addressing it. They're being very positive and very good about sort of trying to find a good middle ground. So I think, I'm hopeful. How's that? So, but I'm usually the optimist here. So, no response. I've been talking with the two authors, and we spent a lot of time reading this, the chairs have, and we do feel it's ready for working group last call. So we're probably going to kick that off and do a forcing function to get people to read that a little bit better. And of course, a lot of that comes out of the DNS Flag Day work. That's what's going on too. So 2845 biz, I kept thinking this was going to be done by now, but some of the comments around readability, Benno has been sort of chasing all this really good. So there should be working group last call soon on that. So a name, that's an interesting one. I left it off the agenda this time because I want to spare you, but we will have something forward. I want to do either an interim or something before Montreal, because I have some way of sort of framing the issues and talking about, there was an interesting draft that Mark Nottingham put out about the internets for the end users and all that kind of stuff. And in the world of DNS, I don't see the end users as the operators of the zones or even the users of the internet. I see it as the application developers that build stuff that use DNS as the indirection layer for what they do. But that's kind of my weird view of the world. And there's a big elephant in the room there with Amazon Web Services. And so I want to do something, but I want to be able to figure out if we can actually move the industry towards us as well as we move towards them. So, and Matthias is going to tell me I'm completely wrong. This is great.
No, not at all. Just my perception of A&M, Matthias Mecking, IC, is that Tony Finch did a write-up and that was posted to the list, and there were crickets, and maybe because people are fed up with A&M. So in a side meeting, this meeting, we plan to actually take A&M and reduce the scope and only focus on the provisioning of site, because the current draft actually discusses A&M on provisioning side, server side, resolver side, and maybe if we reduce the scope, we can actually get some traction again and make some progress.
That would be great. And one thing I've noticed.
Sorry, we are the open source developers.
Yes.
So, yeah, sorry, Matthias mentioned we as a side meeting, but we are the open source developers.
It's the cabal.
Yeah, thank you.
Your cabal. Okay. So, and that's one thing I've noticed. I remember I think it was the last meeting, we talked about extended error and what came out of it, where people were saying, we like this, but we like less of this. And it was like simplifying, sort of giving that sort of least common denominator, that simple set, and that we can always expand on later. Like once we get it to something working and we can move the two industries together, then we can sort of say, okay, that's great, sort of thing. Yeah, I like that. So I was going to contact Tony and tell him, to don't give up hope. So yeah, and that's something I'm not going to give up on. So until you guys kick me out. So I see this as I have we have a problem space that we need to solve somehow. So candidates for adoption, the authoritative recommendations document is fairly interesting, and it's on Friday's agenda. So he just can't stop naming things, right? So Paul's document actually got some interesting feedback about certain things. So we do think there's some things in there we should add. Some of it seems a little excessive, but I'm letting the working group sort of hand that out. You like my new label? So it's perfect. So also, I spoke with Daniel about the validated requirements document. I know there's been some interesting discussions, and it looks like it's starting to come together. So if he gets some good updates coming in the next month or so, we may actually put that up and see how the list says. And so I'm hoping to do a call for adoption before Montreal, if it all comes together, right? We'll see how that goes. So, yeah, and these are some other documents. The Yang ones, these are all being talked about today. Jason's got 2 documents. He presented in Hawaii, thought he had them adopted, I think because he got good feedback, and then he disappeared. And then he came back and said, oh, no, they've been adopted. And it was like, no. They were just sort of presented sort of thing. But they are interesting. And so, especially with a lot of the DNSX stuff, there's some, interesting places there. Our stuff's in the data tracker, our stuff's in GitHub. We try to keep things up to date. So you can always just go check the links. And here's our agenda. Shuman and Pallavi are going to talk about, first, Cheshire is going to give a quick DNS status update thing. He's got only a couple minutes, so he's going to keep it short. Mostly we want you to sort of make sure the DNS people are paying attention to some of those service discovery drafts. So and then Sarah's going to talk hackathon results. And then we'll get into this, which is Shuman and Pallavi talking about multi-provider, Paul talking about 7706 BIS, TCP requirements document, which I know Dwayne presented in TCPM, so I'd like to hear about that. And then Jason's documents, and then the Yang thing. And we put this in, we also, because the chairs always want to know, where are we going with these documents? So we kind of put these little action things in there. Do we think it's this? Do we think it's that? Because we kind of want to be transparent with you guys, but we also want to put stuff in that we know that things are moving, sort of thing. Not so just much presenting for the sake of presenting all the time. So let's get started with the good times. Mr. Stewart, get moving, buddy. So.
As requested, I will keep this quick. 3 documents to talk about. First one, DNS stateful operations of my co-authors are in the room. This is done and published. That's good. That was holding up DNS push notifications, which is built on top of that as a foundation. In doing implementation, Ted Lemon found some anomalies. We had previously decided to adopt the DNS update format for encoding changes. This was before DNS stateful operations even existed as a draft. And Bob Briscoe convinced us that building this on top of DSO was a good move, which I agree with. And we never revisited some of those early design decisions. And Ted discovered that there was an issue that there was no way to express the DNS class when records were deleted. Now, we know that DNS class is hardly used, but we didn't feel it was the role of the DNS Service Discovery Working Group to be deprecating classes. That's a decision for this group to make, but not for our document. So we made some small changes to the document. We will be redoing the working group last call in the Service Discovery group before that goes to IETF last call. The other change we made was in writing the code, Ted Lemon realized that for the reconfirm operation, there was really nothing useful the client could do with the reply. So it was just extra bytes over the air for no reason, extra code waiting for a reply that's just going to be ignored. So we changed that to be a DSO unidirectional message. Again, when we started this work, there was no such thing as a unidirectional message. So now that DSO is finished and published, we're taking advantage of the facilities that has available. I'm here drawing this to your attention because we would like review and feedback. Obviously, we don't think there's any problem with this, but we want to make sure everybody is aware of it. Our goal is to have this, because it's really finished and has been implemented and reviewed and is very mature now, we'd like to get this through the process so that in Montreal I can stand up here and say we have another RFC published. And then the final one is the discovery proxy. Again, in the course of working with Ted Lemon, doing some implementation, he had a few questions about things that weren't clear. My belief is that nothing has changed in the document in terms of the specification, and there are no changes to musts or shoulds or mays or behavior. There is some more explanatory text which reveals things that were kind of in the document but a bit hidden before. One of the main points is that the idea of the discovery proxy is that you pick a subdomain of the DNS namespace and map that onto the .local namespace of a particular link using multicast DNS. And broadly speaking, there's a bidirectional one-to-one mapping that every record that exists in the .local namespace has a corresponding name translated into the DNS tree. But there are some exceptions. For example, link local address records in the local domain are generally not translated because they're not usable outside the local link. And in the other direction, there are some SRV records which conceptually give metadata about the zone. So the DNS LLQ SRV record, the DNS push notification SRV record, they give the target host and port for that service. They don't exist in the .local namespace on the link. So we've added some text to the document that discusses these differences and surfaces them so they don't come as a surprise. I will be sending an email to the list summarizing those changes. I'm here requesting that people take a look at that, and if you agree that these are just changes in explanatory text, then a quick email saying so would be helpful. If you think this changes anything in terms of the protocol, please say that too. And if we have to redo another IETF last call, we will. We want to be transparent about this. And our goal is to end up with a better document that is more readable and more informative, because that's what we're here for.
Thank you, Stuart, for sharing this with Dnsop. Please review. Okay, thanks. Next, Sarah.
So what I just wanted to do was run over the results from the hackathon at the weekend. And we called our table Everything DNS because we now do so many different things at each of these hackathons. We, as usual, had a lot of people, 21 people this time, plus some other people coming in and out. We had 5 projects with kind of multiple people working on them and then 5 other smaller projects that went on. So I'll just touch on 4 of the larger projects. The first one of which has already been mentioned, so I'm not sure there's much more to say in terms of the draft itself. But just to point out that the work that got done was implementations in both Not Resolver and in Unbound. So if you want to go and look at the results of that implementation, that's where you should go. And my understanding is an implementation in DNS Dist is also in progress for that. Second project was DNS cookies. So cookies have been around a while, but the various vendors had realized that there was a problem with interoperability, that one implementation couldn't validate a cookie issued by a different implementation. So Willem had put together, and his co-authors had put together this draft, which came out just before the submissions deadline. And at the hackathon, people got together, worked on this, and we now have 5 interoperable implementations that can do this cross-validation of the cookies, which is a really nice result. There was also work at this hackathon on DNS over Quick. The original draft for this came out in 2007, but stalled a bit because of decisions in the Quick working group to limit the scope of version 1 of Quick. What happened at the hackathon is there was a client implementation in Flamethrower, which is a DNS performance tool written in C++, which is now hosted by OARC. And Quick was added to that tool. And on the server side, what they did was they just wrote a proxy to proxy the DNS coming in over Quick to UDP. And they got this to work. And I don't know if either of the implementers want to say anything about this, but my understanding is that now we've got this sort of proof of concept. There's much more interest now in actually going forward and doing some performance measurements so we can actually begin to understand how this performs compared to DOT and DO.
So is that raw DNS or DO over Quick?
Raw DNS, yeah, as specified in the draft that came out back then. That's the link. And the last of the biggish projects was XFR over TLS, which we have decided to name ZOT. And so in order to, and if you're a fan of Star Wars Rebel Wars, apparently that's what a ZOT looks like, you know. So to support this work, there was more work done on a rather ancient patch to NSD. It's been brought up to date and it's been had some features added. And I believe there are plans to incorporate that into NSD. So that would be the first authoritative open source dot implementation. Whoop. So as well as doing that, what was actually done is that the setup was NSD worked as the master, and because it was a quick thing to implement, Unbound actually acted as a secondary, because A, it can do TLS upstream already, and it can receive zones over IXFR, a feature that was implemented so it could serve zones locally. So the work was done, and we got the connectivity working between these 2 implementations, so that's all good. What we did realize is that we need to take a step back and really think about the authentication model here, because you have various combinations of ACLs, TSIG, potentially certificate authentication. So we need to work through what are actually the best things to propose there. Another thing that came out of this discussion, though, is that it dawned on us that given that we now have stateful operations as an RFC, there is potential here to change the model of XFR and use stateful operations such that a secondary would connect to the master and it would subscribe to the set of zones it wanted to receive updates from, and then the master could use a push mechanism to propagate changes downstream. Now, we need to look into all the details of this, because you could potentially also extend this to having a control channel where the server could signal to the secondary, for example, stop serving this zone, delete this zone, etc. So you could communicate properties about the zone along this channel as well. So there's some potential there to be explored around what we could do with that. This is just the list of the other topics. There was work on Yang models, work on DO support in Stubby, a DNS tap multiplexer, a resolver testbed, work in .dot for DNS Python, and work on ZoneMD in Net DNS as well. This was a team that was there, and we had 5 first-timers at this hackathon, which was really good to have that. 6, sorry, I can't count. 6, thank you. And that's everything. I think we have time for a couple of questions,
Yes,
if anybody
definitely.
has them.
Yeah.
But,
Paul Hoffman, not a question, but an exhortation. I have found on going to the hackathons, I was one of the people who worked on a minor thing on my own, but sitting at tables with people, people would say out loud, blah, 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 and then a minor discussion would happen, which almost always turned into code. It wasn't like when we're sitting out here in the hall and, oh, we can develop this new protocol. And I have some issues with the Zot stuff because you are just developing, you know, XFR version 2 or version 4, depending on how you count. But at a hackathon, if you have code that you are working on, do consider coming to the hackathon because you are around people. You can sort of say, I'm thinking of this, and people will actually contribute ideas that are for code, not just for protocol development.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, Paul, to that comment, DNS, because it has to live in the real world of deployed reality, DNS participation in the hackathon has actually been really good, and both implementers and operators seem to be finding it very helpful.
Okay. Schumann, you're next. Pavali also. Right. Okay.
So we'll talk about the DNSSEC, multi-provider DNSSEC draft. So this draft tries to address the problem of deploying DNSSEC for zones that are signed and hosted simultaneously by multiple DNS providers. We first presented this draft in IETF 101, and it got adopted by the working group after IETF 102. So since then, we have received a lot of comments on the mailing list, and based on those comments, we have updated the draft. So what we did was made the draft now focus more on the multi-signer DNSSEC models. Previously, the draft talked a little bit about the serve-only model, which is primary, secondary, or online on-the-wire signing type of model, but we have removed those and just focused the draft on the 2 multi-signer models. We also added a section on provider migration or inter-provider handoff of DNSSEC signed domains. In this case, the providers could be registrar, registry, and that's the section that we are going to flesh out a little bit more. Another section that we added was key management API requirement. So this is the API that will be used to manage the keys between the 2 providers of the multi-provider DNSSEC. So how this kind of specifies or give a generic format of how the key management, what functions it should do, the API between the 2 providers without going into too much specifics. And then lastly, we have added some text to the security consideration section. It was TBD for a long time. And then now Shuman will talk about the pending work.
Okay, thanks. So I noticed on the agenda, the chairs had listed whether or not this document is ready for working group last call. And I think in the opinion of the authors is not quite ready yet because there's a bunch of pending work, which I am now going to mention. So because we refocused the document on only the multi-signer models, I think it's appropriate to now rename the title of the document also. So instead of multi-provider DNSSEC models, we're going to call it multi-signer DNSSEC models. So if anyone has any objections. I haven't heard any from anyone so far. Please speak up. Otherwise, that's what we're going to go with in the next version. We had a few requests from colleagues to add, since we mentioned two models, we don't really give any advice on how people should select a particular model. We had a debate originally about whether to kind of narrow it down to only one model and remove this question of how to choose. But we decided in the end that, we're probably not going to be able to agree on the model because different people have different preferences. So what we're going to do is just add a section outlining the pros and cons of each so that people can choose. As mentioned, we're going to also flesh out the inter-provider handoff section. So this wasn't discussed in the original version of the document, but lots of people are interested in this subject because if you think about it, what this draft talks about is a model where we have steady state operation of two simultaneous signing providers. But the inter-provider handoff problem of handing off a secure zone non-disruptively from one provider to another, you can think of it just as a kind of interim transitional state of this model. So it's easy to apply the mechanisms, the key sharing mechanism described in this document to solve that problem too. So we're going to provide some more explicit text about that subject. And then another recent thing that came up, I think Tony Finch brought up how these models can be used with CDNS and CDNS key. I answered that on the list, and I think this is just some very simple enhancements. This can be accommodated, and everything will work fine, so we'll flesh that out. And lastly, a question that has been asked a number of times of us is, do we need to flesh out an abstract API for key management and key sharing as part of this document? And we don't have that right now. As Pallavi mentioned, we added a section on API requirements, or what functions a specific API needs to provide so that you can successfully deploy these models. I think that's probably the best we can do because as it turns out, this topic is fairly complicated. Most of the managed providers each have their own proprietary APIs, right? They're not going to switch to a new one just because we design one. So the best we can do is propose what functions they need to implement in their API. And most of those APIs today, frankly, they're not DNS-based. They're typically REST over HTTPS, something like that, a web-based thing. In theory, the APIs needed to implement these models could be done using DNS update or even EPP. So far, I haven't seen much interest from any of the parties interested in these proposals to do that. So the document right now takes an entirely agnostic approach. So these are the functions you need to implement. We don't care about what API is deployed to implement those things. All right, and then the other thing we're doing in parallel is we're working with some running code. So IETF 102, which is in Montreal, I think, we deployed prototypes of both of these models. We tested them with a whole bunch of open source validating resolvers and confirmed that they seem to work fine. There is a key management provider interface done by my colleague Jan, who's an author of this document. I'm going to call him up in a little bit later to talk about that in more detail. And the last thing we're doing is, even though the primary use case that originally motivated this document was working with commercial managed DNS providers that had these traffic management features that were difficult to sign in a cooperative fashion across providers. It turns out, open source is not inconceivable that people will want to do this with open source implementations too. So we would like to see how difficult it is to get these mechanisms supported in open source. And then, so the prime use case for that is the inter-provider handoff. You may or not be using any traffic management features. You're using an open source implementation, but you still want to use this stuff, right? I've done some tests with Bind, and at least the second model seems to be quite easy to support out of the box, even with their automated DNSSEC management systems. And I've had some most of the Bind developers are here, it turns out, so I had some productive discussions with some of my colleagues there about how to implement the second one. So we're not quite sure if that one will, the second one meaning the first model, that's the one I haven't yet tested. So I was advised to try it out, and if it doesn't work, let's fix that. And we're going to look at a few other open source implementations too. And now I'm going to call Jan. Can you come up?
Thank you. So Shimon already said a lot of stuff that I originally wanted to say about the existing code that we have. Like in Montreal at a hackathon, we met for the first time to try this out, and we wrote a simple prototype glue code that just implemented this abstract API or this API that we described very generically, and it made us work with Node.js and Bind by just taking the Bind signing utilities, signing the code keys separately, stitching it all together. And about a month after the hackathon, we actually tried to implement this at NS1 to figure out if there's some different considerations. And it seems that the interface could be real lightweight. We are also talking to different providers who want to support this, and we came with something which we called Key Manager, which can apply on both of these model 1 and model 2. So this diagram just shows how this Key Manager could work, and it also implies how the interface could look like. In the upper part, whatever is in the upper part is essentially the inner workings of Key Manager, and what you see on the bottom is the API of the providers. So the providers provide some different interfaces. Could be REST API in case of NS1 is REST API, and the Key Manager runs on schedule. So the first step is always to pull the public keys from all the providers, collect all the information. If the provider uses, the provider always has at least one key signing key, so it signs this and produces DNS key, CDNS key, CDS set, depends on configuration. And alongside with the configuration, and pushes these records back to the providers. Because the whole point of this, from the protocol perspective, is to keep the DNS records in sync. And this appears to work in both models 1 and models 2. Because this Key Manager can run independently at each provider, and they just need to support each other's APIs. Or you can run this provider completely separately. This manager completely separately from your providers, and you can have better control of the KSK, for instance. I think that that's it. We are definitely looking for feedback on this because our document is informative, and we don't know if it makes sense to come with something more descriptive. And I think it will be I personally think it will be very hard to agree on something because, I don't know, I guess open source vendors will want to do this inbound of DNS protocol. Other providers probably want to use REST API with different authentication mechanisms. And I think it's just difficult to agree on this.
Yeah, questions, comments?
Yeah, so Benno asked me a question, so I'm going to answer that quickly. So Benno asked me, when will we be done with this document? So my answer to that is I'm going to be optimistic and say the pending tasks that we listed in one of the slides, we're going to try and get that done by the next IETF, so within the next few months. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. And we're open for questions.
Paul Hoffman, on your pending tasks, can you go back to that? Is that possible? This might be the bad idea, Ferry speaking, but the inter-provider handoff section, you said you want it, it's specified now how you do it with two active ones. How do you bring one on? Right. How do you get rid of one?
Yeah, so that's also part of it. So I mentioned.
So will you be adding that? Because I don't think that's in the current draft.
So there's really, for this document to be complete, we need to solve the problem of how to not solve the problem, at least describe how you onboard a second provider, an additional provider, and how you get rid of providers, right? So that's all part of the provider handoff section, and I think we at least plan to tackle that, Paul. I don't know if I answered your question, but okay.
I'm Willem Toorop, NLNet Labs. I'm conveying a question from Roland van Rijswijk, NLNet Labs. On the previous picture, what's the difference between the green and the blue key signing keys?
Oh yeah, sorry. The diagram is incomplete. The blue key is the private key. This comes with different diagrams that we used in different contexts. So all the keys you see, the green one, the purple one, and the orange one, these are our public keys. The blue one is private KSK, but it matches the green one.
John Reed, Akamai. One question is this intended as a model for steady state operations where someone has two providers for resiliency, or is it intended more for transitioning between providers, or both, or is there no intention either way?
So the original intention was steady state operation of multiple signing providers. So based on feedback we've gotten, we've since incorporated other functions such as provider handoff and transitions. But I think the original focus of this document was at least steady state operation of multiple providers. But I think we're going to tackle a bunch of additional things.
Okay, thanks. And then if we're considering migration, does that imply that eventually there would be an update to RFC 6781 that would get rid of this idea of non-cooperating operators? Or
yeah, so that's...
Because right now, for example, it's perfectly acceptable to unsign the zone because that's the way it is.
Right. So the people who first accosted us about this interprovider people were from the ICANN and community that has to deal with this problem. And they're actually really looking for a document from IETF that states this is the way you should do it so that you don't have to go unsigned. So if we produce this document, I think that would help them in their conversations in ICANN about how to address that problem.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Christian Grothoff. This might be out of scope for the document, but have you considered using a threshold signature scheme? Possibly with a threshold of 1 if any of the providers can sign it, to maybe keep the protocol a bit simpler?
We have not considered that, but I guess, I mean, that's a possible option. We'll think about it. Right.
Tim Wasinski. I know regex has got a bunch of stuff around registry handoff stuff, and they were looking at this stuff, but it was, I think we need to stop them before they do something bad. Also, there's a side meeting tomorrow. Alexander Meyerhoff is putting it together on registry superlock and some of the discussions around that. And when I discussed DS key sort of handoff, he said, oh, yeah, that's a different thing. And then he just kind of walked away. But if you're into that sort of namespace, I think that's a sort of a, I can't exactly remember. I think it's like 3 o'clock or something like that. So that's a little meeting to sort of show up on. But he said it's a small room, so maybe not everybody shows up. That's all. So just a heads up, right?
Right.
We want to stop the registrars from doing like weirdo things. So.
Yep. Okay. All right. We'll try to clue ourselves into what's going on there.
I don't think this is the appropriate place to say where we need to stop registrars from doing stuff. Paul Hoffman wearing my ICANN hat, we don't get to tell registrars what to do or not. I'm not sure the IETF is a good one either.
No. He's right. So.
Okay. I look at this and the first question I ask is, how do you do policy separation? How do you keep provider A from signing provider B's things? And oh, by the way, who's signing the NSEC records if you've got multiple providers?
Okay, so I think I have a simple answer to that question. So what is happening in these cases is each provider is independently signing the entire zone data. The DNS key RR set is treated differently, and the way you have to carefully manage the contents of the DNS key RR set so that all providers, the union of all the providers' zone signing keys are there, so the validator can always have a valid path to be able to authenticate an answer, no matter where it could have cached the DNS key RR set from one provider and got a signed response of a data record from another. It needs to be able to authenticate that.
So you're adding additional signatures that you don't really need?
No, we're not adding additional signatures. We're importing additional zone signing keys into the Apex DNS key RR set.
But the published data set includes signatures over the RR sets by different providers?
By different providers.
You just told me the entire zone was signed by both providers.
Yeah, independently. So depending, if you get a response from provider A, you'll get a response signed by provider's own zone signing key. If you get a response from the other provider, it'll be signed by their zone signing key.
Okay.
And it does work. We've tested it. And validating resolvers do not treat this as a problem.
One more point to add is you mentioned NSEC 3. So we have addressed that also in the draft, where if the two providers have different modes of doing NSEC 3, like the NSEC 3 param might be different, but the suggestion is both should have, one cannot do NSEC and other do NSEC 3. So I'm just saying that because you mentioned NSEC 3 also. So that's addressed in the draft.
And I'm just reminded that someone accosted me the question just before this meeting, and I think that was Ralph, and he was talking about, are we going to mention anything about the fact that you could get packet size increases in this configuration? And so I think I'd forgotten about, I was planning to do that at some point. So in this scenario, what happens is the DNS key RR set increases in size depending on the model. So those will be bigger than a normal DNS key RR set response, but normal non-DNS key responses, there is no change to the packet size there. And it turns out if you're using something like ECDSA, you can stuff a whole bunch of keys in a DNS key record without even going anywhere near the internet MTU. So I don't think there will be a practical operational problem.
Yes, final question.
Patrick CZNIC. I didn't think this through, but think about aggressive caching and what could happen. Just make sure that you've thought about it.
Yeah, I can answer. It works.
Okay, great.
No, yeah. If the providers use different NSEC methods, they will cache it independently. It's similar. You can roll between NSEC and NSEC 3. You can change the NSEC 3 params, and it works. It's slightly less effective, and we are definitely not doing it easier for the resolver, but it works. And we have a section in the draft that suggests to use the same NSEC mechanism and to use the same NSEC 3 salt.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, so what we had said about this draft on the agenda was to check whether it was ready for working group last call, and I think it pretty clearly isn't, but the next rev we'll try to go ahead and so maybe for Montreal, do keep do keep those cards and letters coming, because this is still very actively under development, but it sounds like it's getting there. Thank you, guys.
Let's see. So, yeah, Paul is next. Right.
Hi there. This is just a very brief update on the 7706 BIS document. Oh, wow. Let's see if it works. It does work. Okay. So since the last meeting, we've published 2 drafts. When I say we, it's Warren Kamari and I. Warren looks up and goes, oh, am I co-author? Yes, you are. So the O2 is, people were asking, since this is 7706 BIS, 7706 had a very specific set of goals, and the working group, we had started, when we started the original 7706 work, it was wide, and the working group asked us to narrow it so that we could finish. We did, but for 7706 BIS, many people have been asking us to widen them again, because now with operational experience, this seems reasonable. So we clarified the new goals in O2, and we added an example of Unbound 1.8. O3, which we just published, we added an example for Bind 914, which was a little bit premature because Bind 914 came out a week after the draft did, but it seems to still be correct. I checked that. So these are the 2 drafts since the last meeting. So, and the working group chair said, hey, is this ready yet? So we, the authors, don't think that it's actually completely ready yet, because we know that there are other providers of this root zone data that will be coming out. The examples in the current draft are how to do it with current or expected future, although now it's current, resolver software with getting things from the root zone servers. That was what was done. Wes Hardiker at ISI has a project called Local Route, and it would be nice to actually talk about that as a provider in the document. And for those of you who don't know Local Route, there's the URL. Lots of people here have heard that ICANN is working on something called Hyperlocal, but we haven't released it yet, so that's in the future as well. And there may be other people who have also thought about how do we provide this root zone data other than the ways that are currently in the draft. So we, the authors, think that in fact it's probably worth waiting to finish this document before, since we know these data providers are coming out. And once we have a collection of those, so we know that there's at least 2, and maybe other people are thinking of becoming a data provider for the root zone in different ways, have a section on those as well to sort of complement the how do you turn this on in your resolver. I think that's the last one. Yeah, so that's what we're thinking now. We still would love comments and suggestions on how to, improve the document until then, but we might wait for a bit. So that's it, and Wes is coming to the mic.
Hi, this is Paul Vixie. It's Wes Hardiker at ISI wearing my Paul Vixie hat. Why is the root special?
The root's not special, actually. We said that in the current draft.
So I guess part of it comes to if we're going to open it up and make it a more widely used thing, why not actually make it even more generic and say this is how you can mirror any zone that allows you to do such things. I mean, as you mentioned Local Route, I do appreciate you dropping my name there.
It's actually not your name, it's your project's name, but that's okay, because you said your name was Paul Vixie. No, sorry.
So the Local Route project actually offers .arpa and rootzone.net, and we're planning on doing some other ones at some point, hopefully in the future as well.
Yep.
And this seems like a useful technology to basically do pre-caching of an entire zone.
For any zone that wants to allow its
correct
zone to be done all at once.
It
Absolutely.
would be sort of useful to actually put in some words in there saying that we're talking about the root zone specifically.
I did in 03, but it was essentially a sentence, because someone on the mailing list, might have even been you, said, is this special? So we said no, but we don't have any examples of that. So if you look in the in the appendices, all of the examples are for the root, because that's the only one that is generally being pushed out now. I think that if we have more interest in the non-root zones for this, we would also want to actually put in examples in the appendices so it was completely clear that that's what we were doing. Not just saying words up in the front, but have examples of doing it for other zones.
Okay, fair enough. And by the way, some of your root zone lists are not actually synchronized.
Oh, so that was what I did in 02. So if I messed it up, by all means, let me know.
Yeah, one of the configs doesn't have like the ICANN transfer one, and the other ones do.
Yeah, send a message on that. A lot of people implement from examples. I'm one of those people, and so getting the examples wrong for me is really bad.
Yeah, and if you want to list Local Route as another zone transfer place, we do support open transfers. If you go through Local Route, then you can actually get a TSIG key and do it securely. So you have glue
right,
and
but
stuff
we would want you to describe that.
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, as a separate thing, because again, even once Local Route is out there and once ICANN has ours out there, that's not to say these are the only places to get them.
Right.
It would be great to have other people who are thinking, hey, well, I can do a better job of this, or I can do a local job of this. Have pretty complete information on what the current folks are doing.
I will send text. Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
Hello, Andreas Schulze. As you just mentioned, that scheme not only works for the root zone, but only for ARPA, in-address ARPA, and IPv6
It works
ARPA.
for any zone.
Yes.
It works for any zone, even further
But
down.
that's something that anybody that operates that mechanism could immediately try out and see that it works. So it's simply a simple proof.
Right, although the side note on that is this should only be done for zones where the zone administrator wants to have them distributed this way. The fact that some zones are accidentally available does not mean that you should use them, because sometimes that accidental availability is not updated as often as the zone administrator would want. For the root zone, that is something that we know is stable. It's very easy to see when it comes out. Other zones are not so careful about that. So I would not say if you find a zone sitting around someplace, you can use it for this.
Matt Poundset. This isn't a fully fledged out idea. It just occurred to me a second ago. But if we're listing sort of non-ICANN projects for downloading stuff,
or even ICANN projects,
or even ICANN, yeah. Well, although this applies a little less to ICANN, the side projects come and go, and I suppose if you were listing a web page that describes the availability of the
ICANN
project,
projects come and go.
That's true, I guess too. Yeah, right. It just occurs to me that maybe there needs to be something in there talking about the fact that sometimes these things might disappear, and you need to be prepared to deal with that.
And you may be stuck with the last zone if you are not monitoring.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was part of 7706 because one of the things that people were concerned about. I don't know, Andrew Sullivan, are you in the room? That Andrew had brought up when we were developing 7706 is if you're like saying, oh, I'm going to do this by mirroring, from the root servers, and you end up stuck on one and you don't realize it, and that one goes away, it gets renumbered or something, you might not know that you're stuck with an old root zone for a while. So actually going back to what I had asked at the mic on the last one, offboarding is really important for this. So I would expect when Wes, when you provide your words on it, you will tell people how to tell if they are stuck. We would have to do the same for hyperlocal and such like that. This is pretty important. So, other questions? Okay, so we will.
I have a question to set my mind at rest. So you put at icons hyperlocal future.
Yep.
But can you give a timeline here?
No. Well, I mean, I could, but do you want me to lie? Do you want me to?
No, but...
You've seen how badly I predict other stuff. Should I predict this one as well? Remember how I predicted there wouldn't be any problems after the key revocation? And I was like flamingly wrong about... I mean, I can keep predicting as much as you want, but it's useless.
It's useless. Okay.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, again, I do it all the time, but that doesn't mean you want it.
No, but maybe you have an idea about 1 year, 2 years, 5 years.
Less than 2 years. Okay. If it's, if it's more than 2 years, there's no way we're going to hold this document for it.
Okay. Thank you. That's what I want to hear. Okay. Thank you. Next, Dwayne. There we go. Just a clicker.
So this is about a draft called Dnsop TCP requirements. This was this slide deck was really written for the TCP maintenance working group, but I thought we'd give it here. So this is cut and paste from the abstract of the document, and it talks about how this is advice to operators, saying why you should, why all the reasons why you should support DNS over TCP, and the kind of bad things that could happen to you if you don't, for some reason, if you don't support it in your network. Again, there's a lot of history here, which was written for that other audience, but the gist of this is that there were some early RFCs that sort of had language in there that treated DNS over TCP a little bit differently than over UDP, and it led to this sort of convention that you would only do TCP for zone transfers, and that got us to a point in the late 80s, 90s, where we were seeing that those sort of things were blocked in firewalls. And then in 2010, Ray wrote RFC 5966, which addressed a lot of those misconceptions and said, hey, TCP, DNS over TCP is really important, and you should treat it the same as UDP. Felt like that RFC went a little bit unnoticed and kind of didn't go far enough, so it was revised. State of the situation is that if you've got a large response in DNS or UDP, your choice is either to fragment it or to truncate it. Both of these can encounter problems. The fragments can be blocked in firewalls. The TCP can be blocked in firewalls. And of course, if you find yourself in that situation, you may be facing a little bit of latency. A lot of us know that today DNS clients have to have a lot of retry logic around this, where they'll hunt for the right size that can get through and so on. So RFC 7766 specified DNS transport over TCP implementation requirements, revised that older one. It made no recommendations to operators and had sort of these recommendations here that said, implementations must support both TCP and UDP. Note that clients may elect to use TCP first. Don't assume that they would do UDP first and then fall back to TCP and so on. But the draft that we're talking about today is the companion document to that, which is advice to operators for DNS over TCP. And it says a lot of the same things. It says that both must be supported in the network. It says that the name server may limit the resources that it devotes to TCP, but it must not refuse TCP just because the same thing would have succeeded over UDP or some other transport. It notes that filtering of DNS over TCP is a really bad idea in general. There may be some reasons why you need to do it, but in general, it's considered harmful. And operators must allow both transports when servicing TCP or DNS. Sorry. So there's a few sections in there that get into more specifics. The first section is about connection admission, and here's a bunch of must, shoulds, must nots. These are all pretty much cut and paste from the draft. So it talks about well, first it says the SYN cookies can be effective in mitigating attacks. Services that are not intended for use by the public should be protected by ACLs. It specifically calls out FreeBSD. It has this nice accept filter thing where you can sort of protect the application from connections that aren't fully established and so on. Let's see. It says applications must not be configured to refuse TCP queries that were not preceded by UDP. So that's just repeating something from earlier. It says the DNS servers should enable TCP fast open when possible. And if you have a cluster, you should use the same key on all those instances. The draft also says that clients should enable TFO when possible. And some of the feedback I got in the TCP working group yesterday was that perhaps this should here was a bit too strong for the way things are today, and that should be changed to may. There was some feedback that there's not quite perfect interoperation among TCP fast open at this point in time. So next, after your connection is established, you have to think about connection management. And the draft says that servers must actively manage their connections, to prevent resource exhaustion. There's a number of ways that can be done. You can provide configurable limits on the total number of TCP connections. You can provide limits on the number of connections per address or per subnet. You can have limits on timeouts. You can provide configurable limits on the number of transactions per connection or the total time of a connection. So all of these things are described here with, again, different, may, should language. For connection termination, the draft talks about, it says that it's very preferable if clients are the ones that close the connection, so they bear the time wait state burden. On systems where servers end up with a lot of sockets in time wait state, may be of benefit to tune local TCP parameters so that that doesn't become a problem. And in very extreme cases, you could use this SO linger trick with a value of 0 to avoid sockets accumulating in that state altogether. And a few miscellaneous points. Somewhere in the middle towards the end of the draft, it says that the recommendations here apply equally well to DNS over TLS. Some of the feedback I got yesterday was that this should be moved up higher in the document so that readers have this in mind from the very start. This draft does not say anything about DNS over HTTPS, which I think that's probably the right thing, but I just wanted to note it in case someone else didn't have that same assumption. And then there's a section about logging, because analyzing and monitoring queries over TCP can be a little bit problematic because you have to do all the things that TCP does. You have to think about connection reuse and reassembling and out of order and all that kind of stuff. So it talks about that. And that's the summary of the draft. I think, geez, I don't know what revision we're at now. 3. This is revision 3. It's been out there for a couple of years. We're trying to revive it and progress it. So welcome your feedback.
Sarah Dickinson from Synodon. So 3 quick comments. 1, there are also privacy concerns with recommending TFO in terms of tracking. So I think backing off that with the current understanding is probably the right thing.
Okay.
Yes to promoting TLS to be stronger as a requirement here. And it's literally just become an RFC, but do you have any thoughts about statements on using or support for DSO? But maybe that's something we can talk about offline. But
just to say that this advice applies to DSO as well. That's what you're suggesting.
Well, I'm wondering we should think about where this fits, because this is sort of assuming that what you're implementing is 7766.
Right.
And I think currently the language is a bit tangled up with doing that. But if you could equally want to support that and DSO, so maybe we just need to find a little bit of language to reference where that might fit in. I know it's really new, but might be
I'm totally open to that.
So
if somebody wants to send, help me write things, that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll send text. Yeah.
Wes Herdiger, ISI. So 7706 has these really useful little config snippets in an appendix. That'd be kind of cool here for some of the stuff.
Okay. We'll think about that. Yeah.
Petr Špaček sees it, Nick, a data point from the recent DNS flag day. No matter what we write in the RFC, if it's just the proposed standard, some operators will claim that's just proposed standard, that's not the internet standard, because the internet standard is only RFC 1035 and 44. And that was the argument I was hearing again and again during the flag day for not doing TCP and all this stuff, because it's not the internet standard. So one thing to think about is how do we promote this or the previous documents like 7766 to the internet standard, so we have like bigger sign on it saying, oh, you really should follow this.
Okay. I don't think I can answer that, but I can talk to people and try to find out how to do that. Yeah.
Sounds like something for the chairs to follow up on, actually.
Thank you. So, more reading or reviews would be very welcome of the document. It was on the mailing list. There have been contributions by the group, but they're, I think, one-on-one.
Yeah.
Not so much on the mailing list. So please do review the document.
Yeah,
so there's been a number of feedback, so I'll put a new version out, or one of us will put a new version out soon, and yeah.
How much has anybody had a chance to review compliance of actual implementations with what you're recommending? Have you or anyone you know of evaluated at all?
But this document is advice to operators.
Right.
The previous one is the implementation advice.
Sorry, yes.
So I think that's probably out of scope for this one.
The underlying question, though, is how much are people actually doing the right thing and we're codifying it, and how much are we trying to get them to start doing the right thing?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of like any tools that we could all just go out and install. Maybe Jerry would know. But I hear anecdotally that TCP support is pretty good in general, except when it comes to maybe some of the harder things like pipelining and reordering and stuff like that. So I think we're close, but not all the way there. Sarah may have some data.
I was just going to say, for open source implementations, some of the web pages on the dnsprivacy.org website try to reflect what is implemented in terms of TCP support for some of these features and TLS support in the open source implementations. So that's there, and I'm constantly updating it. And if you spot a mistake on there, please send it to me, because things can slip by. But that's the best reference point we really have for where the open source implementations are with all this support for all this. It probably doesn't say what the default for those are, just whether it's capable of it. So maybe that's something to add. Maybe that'd be something really good to add. I'll try and remember to do that.
Okay.
Thanks. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Jason. All right, this is one. I have one slide set. Okay, excellent.
So yeah, just one slide set. If you can go to full screen there. Oh yeah, there I can see it. All right, so this is two DNS ops related drafts. These were developed way back when we were starting our DNSSEC deployment, and there were sort of three drafts. The first was negative trust anchors, and got that one done, and then these were sort of the other ones that were to the side, and I sort of forgot about them for a while, and then keeps coming up again and again, and hitting our DNS ops team, and so I opened them back up. And so, they were motivated by a pattern over many years, basically consuming a lot of time and attention of our DNS ops team. And the two key things were, one, recursive operators getting blamed for the mistakes made in authoritative records or by authoritative providers. And then often when those things happened, or just generally, people recommending if you ever see a DNSSEC error, the thing to do is to switch to a resolver that doesn't validate, which seems nuts. And so, this imposes, as a DNS operator, a cost on operators, and it perpetuates a bunch of misconceptions outside of this working group about how DNS works. And it creates a lot, especially around DNSSEC enablement, a lot of, misconceptions that are problematic when you're trying to get more people to use validating resolvers. And so I thought some informational documents might be helpful. Hopefully this working group might be interested. If not, for my own personal sanity, I'll probably take them ahead as individual documents, just because it would be very satisfying just to be able to point to them regularly. So here is a recent example. So, Windows 10 updates are broken again, but it's not Microsoft's fault. And then here's what you should do. Change your DNS settings to these, recommended resolvers. And then like a day later, oops, now Microsoft says an external DNS provider, meaning one of their auth providers, had a problem. And it's going to take a while for downstream DNS servers to be updated, which basically means they had a bad resource record. They had to wait for the TTL to expire out of cache. But in the midst of this, lots of people were encouraged to actively switch to non-validating resolvers and told that their resolver operator was, in fact, the fault of the problem. Neither of those things were true, and this happens all the time. And we've got an example going back even to when the negative trust anchor stuff was set up. I think that time was like nasa.gov or something. So, the two key messages in the respective drafts are, if a resource record, whether that's DNSSEC related or not, just a regular one, is bad or missing or broken or whatever, has a problem, that's not something that a resolver operator can fix. It seems obvious certainly to all of us, but it's not obvious to literally anyone else. So, we can't really fix that as a resolver operator, right? The authoritative has to fix it. And of course, if DNSSEC validation fails, well, that might be for a kind of a legitimate reason, right? And how do you know whether it's legit or not? Probably shouldn't tell people, to switch to a non-validating resolver to get access to that. Maybe you should put pressure on the people to have better signing procedures and to fix that issue, if indeed it's not a security issue. So, it's a sort of a security downgrade sort of thing. So I think, that's sort of the key summary. The documents are very simple at a high level. And I think the question is, are they interesting at all to the working group? I'm sure other resolver operators have seen similar sort of stuff over the years and had to deal with these things. So it's as simple as that.
Is the queue open?
Yeah.
But hi, George. From APNIC.
Jason is allowed to run the queue.
So
okay, I'm running the queue. That's power. That's incredible power.
So I think I mentally summarized, don't blame the recursive problems in the authoritative. And then I thought, when the signaling bandwidth is serve fail,
right?
How do you know? So I think you must say you've got to do extended errors if you want to provide disambiguation, because otherwise, how do I know? Because all I got was serve fail. You did that. You did that.
See, I'm blamed again. That's a good suggestion. Thanks.
That's good. Tim Wyszynski, I read both of these over the weekend, and after we sort of figured out where they went, You don't think they can be combined into
They
one?
probably can, yeah. It's
Yeah.
just an historical, artifact
Okay,
of when I wrote them.
that was sort of my thought was
Yeah.
is and maybe the working group can sort of decide that because they sort of feel like they
Yeah,
fit together in a they have similar sort of sections and stuff. Okay.
Jim Reed, I think it's a great idea, Jason, and I would like to see the working group pick this thing up and take it forward. One comment we might want to look at is issues around validating resolvers that will do soft fail and return answers which are known to be bad because the signatures fail, and maybe some text around that might be needed in the next version of the document.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Matthijs making IEC. Yeah, I also want to strengthen the point that Tim made that I think this should be one document. But and personally, I think it's too obvious that I think, well, should there even be a document for this? But you make a fair point that outside this room, people may think otherwise. If this gets adopted, I would maybe suggest that it's actually an update to the DNSSEC operational practices document, because I think it really falls in scope of that RFC.
Yeah, if we welcome, I think also we should up the work, and combining might make sense. Another thing is that some of the stuff in the errors document might be good for the, well, extended error stuff to add to there, maybe just for explanation, or maybe split extended error in a DNSSEC specific section. But that's just an idea.
So Warren Kumari with no hats. So I like this document, but who do we think the actual audience is? I mean, we know not to do this. Most people in the IETF, I suspect, know not to do this. But users don't really read RFCs, so I still think we should do it, but...
I hear you. I think there's still a lot of people outside of the IETF, obviously, that are researching these things, people in the press, policymakers, you name it. Lots of people blame the recursives for this. Yeah.
Stefan Bartsmeyer. This is a general question of outreach. I don't expect the Go user to read RFC, but I expect the RFC to be read by people who are not here but close. Then they will produce documents that will be read downstream until we reach Go user. So the goal of the IETF, in my opinion, is not to try to explain things to ordinary users. It's not our area of competency, but to produce authoritative documents that could be used by people who are better writers than we are.
Tim Wasinski, actually, I think the audience for this would be like network operation type folks who know DNS but who aren't obsessed about it like we are. And so they have to sort of understand some of these, how do you sort of triage situations? I think that's really I see as the audience for this, right?
Matt Pound said again, same sort of thing. A lot of the audience for this is, Reddit threads about doing dumb things with your DNS because a problem occurred. Like that kind of stuff. Yeah. I agree. I think these are completely in scope for Dnsop. And yeah, we should work on it.
Cool.
Peter Koch-Dienig. I agree with most of what was said about outreach. I'm not completely convinced that an RFC coming out of the IETF is reaching the right audience or instructing those who should reach the right audience. And I wonder what the solution is, except from that it tells the user to suffer through it. Although I'm looking forward to seeing a recommendation coming out of this regarding TTLs, which obviously need to be short to mitigate errors. And then I know that next on the agenda, or next on the agenda, there's just the opposite document. And this is going to be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, well, one remark about the sort of back pressure, if you will, to signing problems for validation fails. I mean, it would be nice for more pressure to go back on the signing practices. So the authoritative zones that sort of aren't getting heat for that, that's the only thing that will help improve their operational practices. Right now, they don't get any of that pressure, really.
Paul Hoffman, who jumped in the line to answer Peter's question, how do we get things better known? There is the IETF blog, which is run by ISOC, who has, when they did a blog piece on the DNS terminology document, I all of a sudden got a bunch of queries from random like tech press and such like that about it. So, so that's one. But the other one is that like just anytime one person catches one of these RFCs and says, hey, I noticed this important thing, lots of other people follow on. So for any of the people saying, oh, is it worth it for us to do it? If we do it with just even a little bit of push afterwards, yes, it is.
Okay, thanks.
Joe Apley, PIR. Years ago, we wrote a document called Help, Help, I'm Being Attacked by Prisoner.iana.org, which was about people who didn't understand their firewall logs. They thought they were being attacked with DNS responses for queries they had sent. And which also, following the logic that's been expressed here, could have seemed like a ridiculous thing to bother writing, because who would bother if they knew to look for an RFC? But it turns out for lots of people that was useful. And I've had feedback from lots of people that said, when I tried to explain to someone that this wasn't a problem, and they told me I was an idiot because I don't know about firewalls, because they work in the IT department, I showed them this RFC and it made a difference. So I think we don't necessarily have to expect that people who need this information are going to read it, but they're going to be pointed towards it. And if it's got an RFC number, it means something.
In short, I support the draft because reasons stated before me. The thing is that when I was doing technical documentation on Red Hat, for example, we wanted to explain to people, don't do stupid things like inventing your own TLD, but there is no RFC we can reference, right? So we were getting complaints, but there is no standard forbidding this and that and blah, blah, blah. So RFC like that would be super useful.
Dan York, employed by the Internet Society, but not speaking for them. The 2 points, actually. One is I like these kind of drafts because, to the point that was made, when I was doing work earlier, 7 years ago, with the Internet Society, focused on IPv6, DNSSEC, and things like that, it was great to be able to refer to some of these operational guidance documents because they were from the IETF. They were pieces that we could go and point to. They could be found in different places. So I applaud that type of thing. I would also just state, Dave Tail, just to say, that is the IETF blog. And to correct Paul Hoffman, that is actually run by IETF folks. It's not actually run by ISOC. So IETF, it is, believe me.
So what you're saying is nobody.
We can have a separate discussion. All right, but it's different places.
Now
That's
the
all I
chair
want
has to step in.
Sorry, Tim Wasinski, I'll just close this all off. Once we have this, where you should be talking about this is NANOG and places like that.
Yeah, exactly.
That we should be at NANOG explaining this is why you can't have nice things, sort of thing. So that's the audience for this type of draft. And yes, we should adopt this stuff.
So as a question, what I'm hearing is that the idea would be that the audience for this is the customer relations departments at operations shops and so on, in order to write user accessible documentation.
Yeah, and tech reporters and bloggers and Reddit users.
Do you have strong feelings about whether to try to combine them into one?
I don't care.
Anybody with strong feelings about that? Because I'm trying to form.
I think one is simpler, but whatever.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to form what we're asking Jason to do.
Dan York again, same. I think the one point here that was also made was we should probably have a little think about some of all of the guidance, the operational guidance parts here, because, you know, to the comment that was made about is this updating the current operational practices, I know that Daniel McGough, Ed Lewis, and I also have the DNSSEC validator requirements, which we were discussing just yesterday, about how it's really more operational requirements for people running DNS recursive resolvers and pieces like that, rather than really requirements as it was stated originally. So there's probably a couple of different things we should think about as far as, because at the end of the day, you want a document, well, there's two things you want. You want a simple document you could point somebody to when you're getting somebody flaming you on this or whatever. You just want to be able to say, hey, look, go do this. But at the same time, you also don't want 5 of those. You want something that you can give to a network operator and say, here's the best practices for how you should be running DNSSEC stuff right now. You know, that type of thing. So I guess I'd say to the chairs, I think we need to think about a couple of these different drafts that are in the hopper and how they could all work together in what way.
And Suzanne, just to go back to your one question about, you know, separate or together, the don't switch resolvers one felt a little bit more sort of atomic and sort of easily, you know, compartmentalized, if you will. But ultimately, they can be in one. It doesn't matter.
Matthijs making IC. When it comes to the question whether it should be one document, I would prefer to be one document for the two reasons that they are so intertwined.
Yeah.
And you want a document that people want to point to, and it's easier to point to one thing than to two things.
Very true. Good point.
Okay, thank you. Any comments? So I think we go forward for one document and then call it for adoption on the mailing list, or maybe with the next meeting. Yeah, thank you. Okay, last presentation by Stanislav Lotka. Is he? Okay, there you are. All present.
You do have the rare luxury of putting a head on top.
Yeah, we are in a luxury position. There we go. And full screen. There we go.
Hi, I'm Láďa Lhotka, and Petr Špaček is the co-author of this document. And to start with, Petr will report briefly about our efforts during the hackathon earlier this week.
Thanks. So current state of things is that during the hackathon, we developed little Yang model which allows you to specify slave zone and IP address of the master. And using this, you can easily add or delete or modify slave zone on Node.dns and PowerDNS, which are two implementations we did. It seems that the idea works pretty well. The implementation, well, it's new stuff for us, so it took some while to get used to it, but it seems to work. So this draft is like the basic building block, which doesn't do anything by itself. But the idea here is to start with something really small, define like the basic building blocks, and then continue on this and build on this and create like more complicated stuff like configuring slave zones and so on and so on and so on. So with this, I will let Láďa explain the rest because he is the Yang expert.
Okay, so this is a summary slide for this draft. The substance of this draft is basically a Yang module that defines types corresponding to these two INR registries, the DNS class and RR types. Since the previous revision, there have been no changes whatsoever to the Yang module itself. We only added like 2 paragraphs explaining more details about the context and use cases. In short, the idea is really at this moment to work on the translation of these two and other relevant INR and other maybe registries and provide this as really a building block for further data modeling work in Yang. Hopefully, this is a relatively straightforward job and hopefully uncontroversial. But again, maybe I'm too naive here. Anyway, there have been 2 issues raised in the mailing list related to the previous revision. One is the relationship between the Yang module and the INR registry itself. Can they get out of sync or cannot? And the other issue that took me by surprise was that the semantics of deprecated differs in different places. I will talk about both issues in more detail in a minute. So just to show you what the Yang types are that correspond to these 2 INR registries. For each registry, we have actually 2 data types. First is just an enumeration of the mnemonic names of the registry entries, and the other data type shown at the bottom part of the slide. They permit to use both the mnemonic name and the numeric representation of that item. So depending on the circumstances, either of these data types can be used. Now, the first issue, there have been a comment in the mailing list that maybe some things in the INR registry are not correct. For example, some of the entries are now experimental and should be moved to obsolete. And there was an opinion that perhaps we can just fix it in the Yang module independently of the INR registry, and this would serve the data modeling purposes. But in fact, we do not recommend doing so, because this draft is based on the assumption that after this working group publishes this initial revision, then the rest, all the updates from that point will be handled exclusively by INR. So all changes to the registry will be immediately mapped to some changes in the Yang module, and the INR considerations section also contains quite detailed instructions about how this can be done. So as soon as we try to fix the Yang module independently, probably this process will break, and I think it's quite a benefit for the working group if as soon as this draft is published, no further work is needed for the forthcoming updates. So, of course, I don't know if you have any opinion about that. I think that, in short, if the INR registry is broken, it has to be fixed in the INR registry, and this will be then automatically mapped to the Yang module, and that would be it. No comments on that. So, the next issue, that's an interesting one. It's the meaning of deprecated. There is now an RFC 8126 that, among other things, also defines the meaning of obsolete and deprecated. So in particular, deprecated means that the use is not recommended, whereas the Yang specification says that, what you can read it, that deprecated permits new implementations in order to foster interoperability with older implementations. So what it means that, let's say, a cryptographic algorithm gets compromised, so this algorithm will become deprecated in the INR registry, but implementers of the Yang module will happily continue implementing this algorithm in order to foster interoperability. So I think this is not really a good thing to do. And I have actually raised this issue in the NetMod working group, and the answer was that this definition of deprecated has been with us since the SNMP time. It was basically literally copied from some ancient documents. But I guess this has to be addressed and somehow resolved. I would, of course, prefer the definition that's in RFC 8126 for INR registries, but this will probably take some time still. Any comment? Yes.
My name is Andrew Sullivan, and I am employed by somebody, but I don't speak for them. For my previous sins, I have opinions about IANA registries now, and the first thing that I would say on your first question was about whether you should fix these things independent of the IANA registry. Really a lot, please don't do that. I mean, it's the worst idea I've ever heard is to get out of sync with that, because the whole point of the registry is that it's supposed to be authoritative. So you would be creating a Yang model that would just drift from that, right? It's a terrible idea. So I completely agree with your idea there. But the second thing that I would say, and that's the reason I got up, is this issue number 2, because the important thing about this in the IANA registries is that if it were true that a type were no longer in use in the strict meaning of obsolete here, then in the Yang sense of deprecated, the obsolete definition, but in order to foster interoperability with older things, that sort of entails that you're going to run into these things from time to time, right? And so the idea is that, in fact, actually the thing isn't obsolete in the strict technical sense of no longer being in use because you ran into it. So by definition, the thing exists somehow. Therefore, the nice thing about this is that you could say that for the practical purposes of this document, everything that is marked as obsolete is treated as deprecated. Everything that is in the registry until this is fixed by by netmod. For the purposes of the current version, you could just say that everything that is marked as obsolete in the registry is treated as deprecated, on the theory that if it were really obsolete, you're never going to run into it anyway, so you don't have to care.
Okay, so do you propose, because currently in the document we have that if something is obsolete in the INO registry, it will be mapped to the obsolete status in Yang, and if it is deprecated, then it will be mapped to deprecated status in Yang. So do you propose to use obsolete for both?
No, what I'm suggesting actually is you can leave the text as it is, and then you could put a sentence that just said, and by the way, we recognize that in Yang, these two things wind up being the same thing, but if it were truly obsolete, it won't matter. You're never going to run into it, so who cares?
Okay.
Right? There's just a sort of practical fact of the matter that you don't have to care about it.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, and that's all. Any more comments?
Okay.
We would like to
Any comments, questions?
We would like to ask for adoption. Hopefully, as soon as we resolve these two issues, there shouldn't be much work to do.
Yeah, it looked to me when I read the draft like it was relatively straightforward to review the data type characteristics specifically. But it's not entirely clear, as kind of as Andrew was pointing out, that the expertise for these issues that you need is in this room. So where are you getting this reviewed in netmod, or where else has it been considered?
Of course, this draft is going to be reviewed by one of the Yang doctors.
Okay.
So we have this problem all the time. So either that people are not experts for Yang, or people are not experts for the particular domain, like the DNS operations here, so we have to work around this.
Well, and we appreciate talking to the DNS people as well as the netmod people about how to make sure this is correct and useful. So.
I'm working for a company where some DNS expertise is expected. So
I think you have to. I think Wes is next.
Wes Hardiker, ISI. So RFC 6168 was written quite a while ago that involved a lot of people working together to define requirements for managing DNS software. And is this, so I guess one of my questions is, did you go and review that for related things? This is a good step toward being able to do that. Or is this specifically just for, are you just really trying to keep it to the IANA specific types? Because there's other stuff in there that might be worth looking at, like TSIG keys would be another type that would be actually helpful to have.
Well, given the experiences we gained from developing Yang modules in the routing area, we are aware that this can be a pretty complicated process, and the RFC that you mentioned shows that, then the work, I think it was called DNS by John and Sarah Dickinson, basically, was also some kind of draft that ended up basically without being adopted. So this can really be a difficult process. But as I said, for us, the immediate goal is to translate these INO registries and motivate further work on this. We ourselves will be doing some work in this area. Other people may have different ideas, but I guess the mapping of the registries is useful just for everybody, and everybody needs it. So why not do it first, and then let's see what's going to happen.
Yeah, I liked what you said in the beginning, that you were really just defining the types that could be used in other places, and I thought that that's highly helpful. And the reason I went to go look in 6168 was what other types, might be missing that's required by that document. And I didn't do an extensive search, but, TSIG keys, for example, came up as one that I know is missing. So, thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, we know that there are other open source developers working on Young NetConf, and the chairs think this is a candidate for adoption. So if there's no here in the room, we will move it to the mailing list somewhere next week or the week after. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
No. We are in the rare position of having a few minutes left. If there's any other business, we'll give you a few minutes of open mic rather than try to drag someone up here that wasn't prepared until Friday. So, any other business? If Stephen Farrell is in the room? Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Then we will give you a 10-minute head start on getting to the cookies.
Thank you.
Wish I'd been prepared to do it to slot something else in there, but we're never under time.
No.
I don't remember the last time that happened.